Good afternoon, everyone. It's Anthony here from Tweaktown. I've been away for a while in Sydney for Qualcomm, packing very soon for another event for Qualcomm, and then off to GDC. But I'm back, hopefully, to a more regular schedule of Facebook Live broadcast starting today, flowing through this week. There's a lot of stuff that's happened in the last week, a lot of leaks, a lot of semi-confirmed news, a lot of teasers, a lot of stuff in the world of technology. So I thought I'd start off this Facebook Live broadcast to talk about AMD's new Ryzen CPUs that are coming and the leaked names, which actually sound really awesome. So Ryzen R7 1800X is the flagship CPU, which sounds ultra awesome. And the way that they've had the naming system going by R7, R5, and R3, if that is how they're going to name it, I think that is a perfect naming scheme for AMD to launch Ryzen, competing directly against Core i5, Core i3, and of course Core i7. I think it's good. It could be different, but I think that it's better than going up to, or maybe that we're going to see R9 be the graphics side and R7, R5, R3 be the CPU side. But we already have R7 with some Radeon graphics, so I'm kind of confused with how that's going to go. Scar says, I think the naming scheme might cause consumer confusion in the future. I think so, and I agree in a way, but I think that this kind of name, the naming scheme they're using, Ryzen R7, it competes against Intel's Core i7 and R5, R3, Core i5, Core i3. It makes sense. This naming scheme makes sense, and I think a lot of people don't like it, only because they haven't really been interested in an AMD CPU for probably many years, if not longer. So I think that this naming scheme will work. I did 10 years of IT retail, and the way that I could sell this to someone is it's very easy to compare against CPUs and names. You know, people go, I want to buy a new CPU. I want to buy, you know, my friend said buy a Core i7. They know that i7 is better than an i5. They know that i5 is better than an i3, and they know that the i7 is better than both the Core i5 and Core i3. So something like this makes sense. R7 is very easy because you can say it's your top tier. That's where 5 or 6 of your top tier processors are. R5 is mid-range, and R3 is the lower-end chips. So it kind of makes sense, but I love the name of 1800X. I think it sounds very powerful versus using a K series or K naming scheme like Intel used for their unlocked processors. 1800X sounds awesome. I cannot wait to say that I have hopefully this is the right name, a Ryzen R7 1800X. That sounds pretty cool. So I'm definitely looking forward to it. Will says, I bet there'll be R9 stuff for servers in the naming of CPUs. I don't know about that, because it would probably be very confusing to have an R9 in a server versus like an R9 390X. I think that would be very confusing, but they might shift and use the R9 as their server chip, which would make sense if they shift away the graphics division away from using the R9 naming scheme. If we see AMD using R7, R5, R3 for the CPUs, I want to see the R whatever number removed from the graphics series, which we have seen with so far with Polaris, with Radeon RX 480, RX. So RX seems to be the naming scheme for the GPUs. I don't think that we're going to see like an R9 Vega. I think it'll hopefully just be Radeon Vega and then a name after like 10X or 11X or whatever they decide to call it. I think that it'd be very good for AMD to keep along that kind of path where they stay away from using R9 on graphics forever. Manuel says, evening, burning the midnight candle with this live. Just got here. Is it worth waiting for Ryzen CPUs? Yes. There is supposedly an event later this month and a full reveal at GDC, which I will be at end of this month in San Francisco. So wait. If Ryzen wasn't coming for 6 months, then I would suggest not waiting and just diving in now. But right now, I think that we haven't even seen anything yet. We haven't even seen a price war, right? AMD is going to have a gigantic price war with Intel. Intel are going to be forced for the first time in probably over 5-6 years now to actually fight for consumers, fight for getting the consumer to buy their chip over their competitor. That hasn't happened in a very long time. And I think that that's going to be a big deal. So if you can just wait just like 3 weeks, 3 weeks. If it was a couple of months, I would not recommend waiting. But we are so very close to actually having the competition launch an actual exciting processor range, an entire processor range. Like, Intel are going to be scared because it's not just a single processor, it's not 2 or 3 processors, it's not 4 or 5 processors. We're talking about an entire family of CPUs, like 17 CPUs. That's crazy. You can see on the list that I provided in the chat, looking at R7 1800X, R7 Pro 1800, R7 1700X, R7 1700, R7 Pro 1700, just in the high-end range. And then you've got like 4 processors in the R5 range, in the higher end, and then you've got another 4 in the mid-range of R5, and then you've got 4 more for R3. No matter where you come from on the spectrum of CPUs, it doesn't really matter if you are an Intel fan anymore or an AMD fan. These processors are just going to kick ass. It doesn't matter anymore. You know, AMD were always 30 or 40% away from Intel's IPC performance, which kept them back from being even a viable reason to upgrade to AMD. You, as a gamer and enthusiast, I'm a massive enthusiast. This is a 1440p 165Hz display. One of the best displays that you can buy. I love this thing. This thing is beautiful. It's my new favorite display. I can't justify upgrading or even side grading or downgrading to an AMD processor right now, be it an 8350 or 8370. I have both of those chips in the house. They're great, but to drive the 165 frames a second at 2560 by 1440 is not easy. AMD, 1, do not have graphics power to handle that, and 2, they don't have the CPU power to handle that. That changes with Ryzen and it changes with Vega. They're going to secure all those enthusiasts that they either lost, which were a lot like me. I moved away from using an AMD CPU because they didn't concentrate on the enthusiast arena at all. But I think that people will be won back by these kinds of chips, especially if they can offer Core i7 6900K performance for even $300 or $400 less. It doesn't matter what side you barrack for, that's going to be a better deal. Why would you then spend more money on Intel for the same performance? It makes 0 sense. Where now you'd spend sometimes the same, if not more money on AMD and have less performance. That makes no sense. If you can buy an AMD chip and it's $200 cheaper than the Intel equivalent, and the motherboard is say $100, $120, $150 cheaper, that $300 that you save allows you to buy the higher end CPU, a better motherboard, or if you're not silly, put that money towards a new video card or put it towards a new gaming display. I think that's the more interesting part, which excites me a lot, especially when you mix in a new AMD Ryzen CPU with Vega graphics card. I'm going to go through a few of these questions. R7 reminds me of the mid to low end video card, so if anyone knows AMD, it might tend to think, oh hey, it's like R7 GPU, not R9. Then with Intel comparison, people who know AMD as the people who have fallen behind might think there is a naming scheme that can be misleading if they aren't aware of performance. And I do agree with that. And I think that AMD needs to do a very good job at differentiating the R7, R5, R3 naming system away from the graphics cards. And I think that they've done enough of that in the last year. And I think by the time they're ready to sell Vega, that Ryzen would have been on the market for a couple months, which it will be. Ryzen will start selling in about a month's time, or under a month's time, beginning of March. I think that we'll see a shift away from AMD ever considering naming a video card R9 because of the new CPUs being launched. Remember that the last R9 release was from the 300 series and the Fury series at the time. We haven't had an R9 release with the Polaris system, side of cards, where we've only had Radeon RX 400 versus R9 400 series. So that's where a lot of sites will report, oh, there's Radeon R9 490X coming. No, there will not be another R9 graphics card. If there is, AMD really have screwed up the naming system. So I do agree with that. They need to stay away from it. Albert, Ryzen for laptops, yes, end of the year. Raven Ridge is what you're looking for. They will have an APU, which most likely will have Vega GPU cores available towards the end of the year. Yannick, AMD is like the little brother no one wants until they're here. And I think that right now, it's so polarizing between Intel and AMD, but I think that that will all change with the release of Ryzen. I believe that anyone who is really anti-AMD will be crying into their hands when this stuff launches, because People, I think there was a comment just before. Someone said it better have the same performance as a Core i7 6950X. No, it doesn't need to do that. This is how many customers buy a 6950X versus the amount of people that will buy mid-range chips. The high end is just headlines. It's wank value. Name how many people do you know that owns a 6950X processor? I only know a few that are in the industry. A few graphics card reviewers that actually own a 6950X. Everyone goes out and buys a 7700K. Everyone goes out and buys a 6700K. Most people go out and buy a Core i5 processor. You don't need to have high-end CPUs for games anymore. This is why I think that even the highest end chips from AMD, you won't even need to buy that. I'll most likely be recommending the R5 series to most people. R5 1600X, 6 cores, 12 threads, with the performance of a Core i5 7600K. That's all you need. If AMD can price that thing at like $200, $250, they've got it. That doesn't matter about the price of the 1800X. The 1800X is the big one that'll fight against the 6900K, but the 6950X is a completely different ballgame compared to the 6900K and the 7700K. Completely different. You're talking about a completely different kind of CPU. I think that Ryzen can be a CPU that we need for now. We don't need to have 50 threads of CPU performance and 10 gigahertz. Like the technology inside of this, where SenseMI adapts to the cooler that you're using. It'll run at a certain frequency. If you're on X cool, like you're running stock cooling or you're running a Noctua air cooler, then you're gonna be slightly faster, and you might be using a Corsair all-in-one Hydro series cooler. So I use in all of my PCs, so I'm looking forward to seeing the performance between an air cooler and a water cooler. I want to see what the guys on LN2 are going to do with it. Intel don't have anything like that. So sure, 6950X is awesome, yay, lots of processing cores, yay, it's really fast, yay, it's like $3,000. But no one uses 20 threads in a game. 20 threads of CPU performance in a game. Name a game that actually uses 20 threads. And even if there is a game, it's like 1 or 2 games compared to every game in the market that's pretty much using a quad-core processor to its full potential. I think that we're going to be safe, and I really think that the high-end 8-core 16-thread CPUs that AMD are releasing, they'll be the high-end chips, but you won't need that. And even then, the second lowest R7 chip, the R7 1700, it still has 8 cores and 16 threads, and it's got the performance of a 7700. Remember that the 7700 from Intel is only an 8-threaded CPU, so you're actually getting twice the CPU threads, twice the CPU cores, because you've only got a quad-core chip, so 4 physical CPU cores with 4 cores provided, or 4 threads provided from hyper-threading, where AMD are providing you with an actual 8-core CPU with 8 threads through SMT. That's amazing. You're actually getting more CPU threads with a cheaper processor, and probably higher performance, because that's only at 3 to 3.6 gigahertz. So if you overclock that, it's going to beat a 7700, and the motherboard should be cheaper as well. So it's exciting. Like, I'm actually excited. Someone said this is bulldozer buzz again. Yes and no. This is buzz, but I think that the bulldozer buzz was just bullshit. And a lot of companies have to do it. So imagine that you've worked 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years of your life, and your company's like, push bulldozer is the next big thing. Of course they're going to push it, of course. But I never moved to bulldozer. I totally agree. I think that AMD have completely failed in the CPU division for a very long time. But there are spikes where AMD were the absolute leader, the first to market with a dual-core processor, first to market with a 64-bit processor. The Thunderbird 1.4 gigahertz at the time was just amazing. Intel had nothing. The race to 1 gigahertz, AMD. They were pushing with new CPUs all the time. I think in the last few years, especially with the internet and Reddit and social media, AMD has just had a lot of flack, because they have, and this is their fault. They've just been bragging up their CPUs like they're going to be this market-leading, changing thing, and then bleh, and then bulldozer, bleh, 8350, 8370, bleh, and it just hits, and it just doesn't do anything. So now because they've been crying wolf so many times, a lot of people don't believe that Ryzen is actually the shit, and that it can actually do anything. Where I personally think it will. If AMD are hitting the 30-40% IPC improvement that they're saying that they are, I totally believe them. They've showed off benchmarks that I've been in front of. 6900K versus Ryzen, and they didn't even tell us which chip it was, and it was keeping up in Battlefield 1. They had 4 Titan X and SLI to remove any GPU bottlenecking, 6900K versus unnamed Ryzen CPU, Battlefield 1, Titan X SLI, 4K, I couldn't tell the difference. When you get to that stage of using Titan X SLI and you're using CPU v CPU and you can't tell the difference, you know that it's fine. If they went, look, you know, this CPU is going to be $400 cheaper, but it's going to be 20% slower, and you could tell the difference, then yes, that's completely different. When you can't tell the difference, when it's a side-by-side comparison, and you cannot tell the difference, Battlefield 1 at 4K is not easy. It's not easy to run, and it's very CPU dependent, especially at 4K. That's pretty good, you know. That's very, very good. You're gonna capture the professionals with an AMD chip. They might think a 6900K or a 6950X is just too expensive. I might buy a Quadro card instead, but I still want 16 threads of CPU performance. That means you have to go to an LGA 2011 socket, which is very expensive on the motherboard, probably $400 plus for a good motherboard. You need to have quad channel RAM, so there's a bunch of money on RAM. You don't want to buy 16 gig, you gotta buy like 64 gig or 128 gig. That's a ton of cash you gotta spend on RAM, where people will buy, you know, enthusiasts and performance gamers and professionals will actually buy high-end AMD CPU phones, which I can't remember the last time that ever happened. That's why it excites me. Thank you guys for tuning in, as always, and I will see you guys in the next video.